Today it happens to be Ash Wednesday and the beginning of the Lent season. It's very interesting that we have been reflecting on Lament because to a certain extent Lent is about lament. And you friends have done a wonderful job at reviewing Rachel's cry. The question of lament in the face of tragedy, loss, suffering. And as you notice in that text, there are psychological and theological perspective, or you might say lenses, that focus on this process. So psychologically, for example, you have reference to the catharsis, to the externalizing anger, the sadness, affliction. So lament as a necessary emotional and psychosocial process for healing, process as well as a behavioral response. Theologically speaking, what we have is a spiritual struggle, we might call it, that is also a necessary process for spiritual growth. So the two go hand in hand. I want to add that lamenting in the face of suffering and loss is a universal human phenomenon, as a psycho-spiritual process. Across cultures, through the ages, there has been lamentation. And this appears, of course, in the sacred texts of the great religions, in folklore and other cultural manifestations. Interestingly enough, among animals, remember animals from anima, psyche, soul, there is also sadness, the possibility of sadness, and a form of processing of the loss. Interestingly enough, animal psychology has a lot to say about that. But animals don't have spirit. So we don't have the spiritual struggle, we have the psychological struggle. Just as a footnote there, I want to add also something that you will find in the Moodle site for this week regarding interdisciplinary lenses, or how we look at situations, especially for caregiving, of course, from a psychological and theological perspective. As I said, you will find the material in Moodle in the form of a PowerPoint. So here on the board, I just put the skeleton, as it were, of my way of depicting this. There are four possibilities here, and the ideal, the sought-for situation is where the theological and psychological dimensions coincide towards healing. We can call this theologically adequate and psychologically functional. But there is also the possibility of theological adequacy may go hand in hand with psychological dysfunctionality. For example, when certain, let's say, with praying, or for somebody in the midst of a spiritual struggle, while assuming that God is just and wise and made us free. So we have this possibility of suffering in spite of God's grace and justice and power. Remember what Doran says, or includes the 5 types of responses in the face of evil, for example, in the book. But you have also the possibility that the theological rationale is inadequate, but it is psychologically functional. For example, God knows better. God has a plan for my life. He's testing me. I suffer here, but I will be rewarded in the afterlife. Or maybe I have been chosen to suffer, etc., etc. So this is what in psychology is called positive religious coping. Even if the theology is faulty or from another theological perspective, inadequate. In our own congregation, for example, there's somebody in a dying process, and this person is consoled in the fact that in his view he's going to go to see his parents. One doesn't challenge such a view, even if one doesn't necessarily affirm that in the afterlife one will meet the nice people that we had here on earth, or one's pets, and you name it. So you have then 4 different possibilities, and the worst case scenario would be when the theology is inadequate and the psychology is totally dysfunctional. For example, when people assume that God is punishing them or has utterly abandoned them because they are not worthy of God's love. So that is the worst possibility. I wanted to bring that and also connect with the fact that as we celebrate and go through the church season of Lent, what is the theology, and what does it do to us, both emotionally and spiritually? And here I want to bring a book, a very recent book, written by Jennifer McBride. It's called Radical Discipleship. I hope we can, you can see it here. Is it possible to zoom and see the book there? I met Jennifer in October. She's teaching right now in McCormick, and hopefully she will be contributing to our program here in one way or another. In this book, The Radical Discipleship, A Liturgical Politics of the Gospel, that I strongly recommend to you, what she does is go through the seasons of the life the church. And for Lent, I will read just 2 or 3 paragraphs to illustrate the point here about Lament and Lent and psychological functionality. She says, Christians often view Lent as a time to perfect oneself, to catalog sins and get right with God, in quotations, rather than a time to foster vulnerability. Yet, as the beginning of Lent, Ash Wednesday directs us toward our common vulnerability, finitude, and weakness, and announces the truth of human solidarity. You are but dust, and to dust you will return. And a little further in the book, the section on lament as protest. Lament announces hope's presence. Authentic lament is the force that pushes the church to live into the promises of God, those promises of personal and communal wholeness and healing. The promise the Bible calls shalom. Because lament is tied to hope, it is, according to Paul Luther, one of the authors she's quoting, a form of political action. Lament is protest to God in prayer, crying out for God to make God's healing justice concrete, and protest through our embodied lives, through creative acts of justice that increase solidarity with others and participate in God's kingdom come. So, as we start this Lenten season, while at the same time studying together and working on caregiving practices and reflection on that practice, may we become better and better pastoral theologians, as well as competent and faithful caregivers, while at the same time tending our own spirit. May that be so. Blessings.